All right, deep divers, welcome to a deep dive into some, pretty interesting ideas about gender roles and societal expectations. And get this, our source material is an excerpt from a 1971 book called, and I'm not making this up, The Dark Side of Happy Wife, Happy Life: Men Expose the Truth.
Yeah, it's a real snapshot of a specific moment in time. And honestly, some of the ideas might feel, surprisingly relevant even today.
Yeah, no kidding, right. Like, we're going to unpack this idea of waves of indignation that the author keeps mentioning. He says that every few years, some men feel this kind of surge of, I don't know, frustration, I guess, with this whole happy wife, happy life thing. What do you think about this cyclical pattern? Is it
Yeah.
just like complaining, or is there something deeper there?
Well, it is a provocative claim, right? But think about it this way, like, what if they're actually pointing to some kind of deeper tension? A tension in how relationships and expectations were changing back then.
So you're saying it's not just a historical curiosity, but maybe like an early sign of some of the cultural shifts that we're still dealing with today.
Yeah, exactly. It makes you wonder, like, have these tensions ever really been resolved? Or have they just, I don't know, morphed and taken on, new forms over time?
Okay, well, buckle up because the author really doesn't hold back. He actually argues that men are basically like conditioned, almost like Pavlov's dogs, conditioned to cater to women's desires, especially through advertising. That feels a bit extreme, don't you think?
Well, it's important to consider the context. I mean, he was writing in the early 70s, right? It was like the golden age of advertising. Think about
Right.
messaging at the time. A lot of it was aimed at women, right?
Yeah.
As the primary decision makers in the household. So it wasn't necessarily, I don't think, about like overt manipulation, but maybe more about tapping into like, existing social roles and maybe amplifying them
Yeah.
for commercial gain.
So maybe it's less about like turning men into mindless consumers and more about leveraging those existing power structures and expectations.
Yeah, precisely. And the author even claims that even back then, women actually held significant consumer power, which is, it makes you rethink this idea that women didn't have financial agency back then.
Wow, that's a really interesting point. So how has that dynamic like evolved? Especially as women have gained more economic independence.
Well, that's where it gets really fascinating. On one hand, women's financial power has definitely grown, but on the other hand, the amount of marketing and advertising, it's exploded. We're all just bombarded with messages about what we should want and need, regardless of gender.
Okay, but here's where things get a little dicey. The author makes this really this eyebrow-raising claim, let's just say, about women becoming, and I'm quoting here, increasingly more stupid due to a lack of competitive stimulation. And while men are apparently getting smarter, yikes, right?
Yeah, let's be careful here. I mean, that statement is obviously rooted in the gender norms of his time, and it needs to be taken with a grain of salt.
Totally. It's definitely jarring to read that today. But it does make you think, right? Like how much of our, perceived intelligence or even the opportunities that we get to develop it are shaped by like societal expectations.
That's a really important question. And, think about the fields that were considered, traditionally male versus female back in 1971. Access to education, career paths, even just, like the encouragement to pursue certain interests. They were all very different for men and women.
And of course that's, before the huge push for women in STEM and the fight for equal opportunities that we've seen in the past few decades.
Exactly. So while that statement about intelligence is, problematic to say the least, it does highlight a very real issue, right? About how societal structures can really impact individual potential.
Right. Now get this. The author also attributes this shift in female self-awareness to the introduction of the birth control pill. Remember, this is 1971, just a few years after the pill became widely available.
What's really important to remember here is the profound impact of readily available contraception.
Yeah.
I mean, it undeniably changed, like, the whole landscape of relationships and family planning.
That's a huge understatement. It completely changed, the game in terms of how women could control their own bodies and make choices about their lives. It's almost impossible to overstate, the impact that had on everything from dating to careers to like the structure of families.
And, the author was writing at a time when those ripple effects, they were still, spreading, and the full impact was really just, started to be understood.
Okay. Well, deep divers, let's kind of flip the script a bit. The source also talks about how industries target men's desires too, particularly through the, let's just say, adult entertainment industry to drive consumption.
And this brings up a really interesting question about, like, the portrayal of male-targeted marketing. Is it really, like, an accurate reflection of male desires? Or is it more of a, like, manufactured perception that industries can, they can capitalize on for profit?
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's like, are they just giving men what they want? Or are they creating this need and then, offering a product to fill it?
Exactly. And it ties back to, that earlier discussion about manipulating desires through advertising. And the author actually uses Playboy magazine as a very specific example of this. He contrasts, those provocative images with those intellectual articles that were, also featured in the magazine.
Yeah, that is an interesting juxtaposition. But is it a fair critique? I mean, a lot of magazines, even today, they mix, light entertainment with more serious stuff. Is Playboy really that different?
It's a thought-provoking observation, yeah. And maybe a bit of a product of its time. But it does raise this bigger question, I think, about, like, the role of media and entertainment, in shaping our desires and perceptions.
And the intention behind those messages, right? Like, are they just catering to existing desires, or are they actively cultivating them, for commercial gain?
Exactly. It makes you wonder, like, how much of what we want is really our own, and how much of it has been shaped by the media that we consume.
Okay, deep divers, get ready for this next one. The source kind of paints this picture of homes filled with junk that was, purchased by women, symbolizing this, like, clash of aesthetic preferences and priorities.
And that observation, it really resonates, with the discussions that we have today about gendered spaces.
Yeah.
And about expressing your personal identity through consumerism.
It's like that classic, like, battle of the minimalists versus the maximalists playing out in living rooms everywhere.
Right. Exactly. But think about the deeper implications. Like, are men conditioned to be the providers? Working all the time to fund a lifestyle that mainly benefits their wives.
Yeah.
Like the author suggests. Or is that just, oversimplifying a much more complex dynamic?
It definitely makes you think about how we negotiate our spaces and our, possessions within relationships. Like, who gets to decide what comes into the house, and what does it say about, about our identities, and how has that changed over the past 50 years?
That's a great question. And it leads to another really interesting observation from the author. He talks about the really stark difference in the popularity of Father's Day versus Mother's Day, even back in 1971.
So even then, Mother's Day was a bigger deal.
Apparently so. And the author suggests that this difference, it says a lot about how society values, or maybe, undervalues, the roles of mothers and fathers.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. It really makes you wonder if those perceptions have shifted in the past 5 decades, or if we're still, dealing with those same imbalances. But I think we need to take a deeper dive into that in the next part of this episode.
Welcome back, Deep Divers. So before the break, we were talking about how, products were marketed to men and women back in 1971, right? And the author suggests that while women were encouraged to kind of indulge in luxury goods and home decor, men were mainly targeted with products related to work. Or just basic needs, like clothing and food.
Yeah. It's almost like he's painting this picture of, like, 2 separate consumer worlds, each with its own set of rules and targeted messages. What do you think that's really an accurate reflection of the advertising landscape back then? Or is he kind of exaggerating to make a point?
Well, we have to, think about the context, right? In the early 70s, second wave feminism was really challenging traditional gender roles. And there was this growing awareness of how advertising, how it could perpetuate stereotypes. So maybe the author was picking up on those anxieties and expressing them through this lens of consumerism.
So maybe it's not so much about, the products themselves, but about the message, like what it says about what men and women should value and aspire to.
Exactly. The author even uses the term homeless creatures to describe men, like suggesting that, they're constantly moving between the office, where their worth is, measured by their productivity, and a home that's filled with items they didn't choose, a home that feels more like, a shrine to their wife's desires.
It's a pretty it's a pretty bleak image, right? This idea of a man feeling like, alienated in his own home, surrounded by what he sees as, like, unnecessary junk. But I don't know how much of that is really rooted in the actual advertising of the time, and how much is the author just, projecting his own frustrations onto this larger trend.
That's a great question. And it really highlights, the challenge of interpreting a primary source like this.
Yeah.
So we have to consider, like, the author's own biases, his own experiences, but we also have to try to understand those broader, cultural forces at play.
Right. And it's not like those forces have, completely disappeared. I mean, think about, even today, how many ads they still play on those traditional gender roles, right? Even if it's in a more, I don't know, subtle way, or even like ironic.
Absolutely. The landscape has definitely evolved. But that underlying tension, between individual desires and societal expectations, it's still there.
Okay, well, let's not shy away from the elephant in the room here. The author also has some, let's call them interesting observations about the sex industry and how it targets men's desires.
Yeah. He argues that the sex industry, it exploits men's desires to drive consumption using, everything from suggestive imagery to language to kind of, trigger those urges.
Yeah. And it's interesting because he even calls out Playboy magazine again. Contrasting those images with the intellectual articles that were also in the magazine. So is he saying that men are basically being tricked, tricked into thinking they're engaging in these intellectual pursuits when really they're just being, manipulated by their base desires?
I think that's a little cynical, don't you? I mean, people are capable of appreciating, both intellectual stimulation and other forms of entertainment. To say that men can't tell the difference, it just feels a bit, reductive.
Okay, yeah, I see your point. But it does make you wonder, right? Like, how often are we sold something, under the guise of like sophistication or intellectualism, when really it's just appealing to our basic instincts. It happens with everything from, cars to cologne to, well, you get the idea.
That's true. And it goes back to that question, right, about the manipulation of desire. Are these industries just giving us what we want, or are they actively creating these desires and amplifying them, to make money?
It's like there's this constant like push and pull between what we actually want and what we're told we should want, and it's not always easy to tell the difference. But hey, maybe that's the point of this whole deep dive, right? To make us think critically about those influences and how they shape our choices.
Exactly. I mean, the goal isn't really to get to some definitive answers, but to explore these questions with nuance and curiosity.
Right. Okay, well, speaking of nuanced questions, let's get back to that observation about the difference in popularity between Father's Day and Mother's Day. Even back in 1971. What do you think the author was trying to say with that comparison?
It is fascinating, isn't it? Even 5 decades ago, he noticed this difference in how we celebrate, mothers and fathers. It suggests that even then there were these different expectations, right, placed on mothers and fathers.
So maybe it's not just about who gets more gifts or cards, but about like a deeper message about the value of each role.
Precisely, and makes you wonder, how much have those perceptions actually changed over time? Have we really made progress in recognizing the equal importance of both parents, or are we still holding on to these outdated ideas about motherhood and fatherhood?
That's a question worth exploring, but I think we need to save that deep dive for another episode. For now, let's move on and talk about what the author says about how these gender dynamics, how they play out in the home. So we've been talking about this book from 1971, The Dark Side of Happy Wife, Happy Life, right? And it really paints this interesting picture of gender roles, especially in the home. And you mentioned this idea before about homeless creatures, how men felt kind of alienated in their own spaces because of all their wives' purchases. Do you think that like resonates with how we think about gendered spaces, today?
It's definitely a powerful image, yeah. And I think it speaks to this bigger truth about how we express our identities, through our environments. Think about it. How often do we decorate our homes, to reflect who we are or who we want to be?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, my Instagram feed is basically just like, a constant stream of perfect living rooms and kitchens. But is that, I don't know, is that desire for a beautiful space? Is that really like a female thing? Or is that just, another stereotype that we've been kind of conditioned to believe?
That's a really good question. And remember, the author's perspective is from over 50 years ago, right? Back then, things like interior design or homemaking, those were seen as, female domains. But they've definitely shifted since then.
Yeah, for sure. I know tons of guys who are like just as into interior design as any woman. And let's be honest, there are plenty of women out there who couldn't care less about, throw pillows and accent walls.
Exactly. So that image of the home as this, like battleground, with these clashing preferences, it feels a little outdated, I think. Today, it's more about, finding that balance, a way to create a shared space that reflects both partners, right? Their personalities, their needs, regardless of gender.
Right. It's like that old saying, happy wife, happy life has become more like, happy partnership, happy home. But let's be real. Finding that balance, it's not always easy. I mean, have you ever tried to like merge two completely different design styles into like one cohesive space? It can be tough.
Oh, for sure. It could definitely be a challenge, but it's also, it's an opportunity to be creative.
Yeah.
To find those compromises and to learn more about each other's tastes and what they like. It's all part of, building a life together.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Okay, but this whole deep dive, it's also made me think about like how consumerism itself plays into this. We're constantly being told like what to buy, what to want, how our homes should look. It's hard to escape that pressure, no matter who you are.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it goes back to that idea we talked about before, right? About manipulation of desires. Are we really making choices based on our own like needs and wants, or are we being, kind of subtly influenced by these outside forces?
It's like we're all just swimming in this sea of consumerism, and it's hard to tell, which way is up sometimes.
Which is why, it's so important to be aware of that.
Yeah.
To be aware of those influences and to make conscious choices.
Yeah.
About what we bring into our homes.
Yeah.
And our lives. It's about finding that balance between, expressing ourselves through our things and not letting our things, define us.
I like that. Yeah. It's about being intentional, not just, blindly following trends or trying to keep up with the Joneses. But speaking of keeping up, this whole deep dive has made me rethink the idea of progress. We've come a long way in terms of challenging gender roles, but have we really moved beyond those underlying, I don't know, those anxieties, those tensions?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I don't think there's an easy answer. We live in a world that's constantly changing. And these conversations about gender, about relationships, about, what society expects from us, they're always going to be happening.
So maybe the real takeaway is that there is no like finish line, It's not about reaching some perfect state of equality or balance. It's about continuing to question, to challenge, to evolve, to change our understanding of ourselves and each other.
Exactly. And that's really the power of a deep dive like this. It's not about, providing all the answers. It's about starting those conversations, encouraging us to, to look at the world, look at everything with a critical eye, and to question those assumptions. The assumptions we might not even realize we're making.
So, deep divers, as you go about your day, think about those assumptions. Think about how you navigate your own spaces, how you express who you are through your things, and how you figure all that out, in your relationships. Because as we learned from this trip back to 1971, these conversations about happy wife, happy life, they're not over. In fact, they might be more relevant than ever, and that's where we'll leave you today. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.